Okay, April the 16th, 2022. Well, let's start off by looking at the latest developments in the Russian war against Ukraine. The Ukrainians have scored a big hit there with the destruction of the cruiser Moskva, which is a flagship of the Russian Baltic fleet. And it's interesting that was destroyed with two indigenously designed and manufactured Neptune missiles. Um, and what's really interesting is that the ship itself was a heavily protected ship. It had was armed with some of the latest surface-to-air missiles, both long and short range. It also had the Russian equivalent to the phalanx system. It's not our system, but their Gatling gun system for terminal defense. Um, and and one would think in a situation like this that, well, maybe it was swarmed with a large number of missiles, and it was just swarmed with so many missiles they couldn't hit them all, and some got through. No, they launched two. They managed to score and hit it and set off secondary fires and explosions, which eventually caused the ship to be abandoned, and then eventually it sank while they were trying to tow it back into port. A big win on the Ukrainian side, which the Russians initially tried to claim was just some kind of mishap. But of course, if their ships self-destruct at that level, that's almost as bad as the Ukrainians, or good, or how you want to look at it, as the Ukrainians managed to do what apparently really did happen. And of course, now the Russian Navy is pulling their surface ships back away from the Ukrainian coast. And so that's kind of the latest development on that. Very interesting. The Russians then apparently did retaliate with some missile attacks on Kyiv. So their denial isn't exactly credible. Let's put it that way. But if you like these videos, please subscribe, give me a like, and you can ring the bell for notifications, and comments appreciated. Yeah, this is and this kind of leads into the general situation here on the ongoing war, which seems to have reached a bit of a stalemate at the moment. Again, the Russians have pulled away from their northern incursions toward taking the capital city, but their eastern operations, which have been relatively, I guess I wouldn't say static, but not that aggressive, are still there, and they're blocked by Ukrainian forces near Kherson in the south, preventing any advance toward Odessa. And then otherwise, I guess they've kind of consolidated a bit of their fronts. So right now it looks like they're sort of engaged in the second of my options I discussed in a previous video, of kind of holding a ground and going on the defensive, and maybe waiting for the Ukrainians to launch their offensive. This tactic sometimes works. I know that, back in the Yom Kippur War, the Israelis on the Sinai front eventually went to that approach of just kind of waiting till the Egyptians finally attacked to draw them out, and get them a little bit, we say, offside so they could counterattack. So this is possibly what's going to happen. The other factor apparently is that the conditions are reported to be pretty rainy in that area, a lot of mud, and so open field armored operations aren't very effective, so not the right time for blitzkrieg, so to speak. So again, we're just waiting to see what happens next. The siege of Mariupol is continuing. I understand the Russians the other day actually launched a major attack with their Tu-22M bombers, kind of a classic carpet bombing type approach from high altitude, I assume. And I don't know how effective that was, but it looks like they're slowly but surely whittling down the resistance, which is running low on supplies. I understand that perhaps there have been occasions where helicopter runs have been made in there to provide some minimal resupply. But that's kind of the situation on that in that conflict. And another issue that's come up on there is the issue that the CIA director raised about the potential for that Russia could get desperate enough to engage in some sort of nuclear activity. And so that's a real risk, I think. The real question going forward is exactly what are our objectives here. I mean, we've supplied another $800 million worth of equipment, which is in the process of being delivered. I don't know how quickly it really gets to the front. Most of the stuff we provide can be, I guess, fairly easily integrated into the Ukrainian military. I guess the real question is exactly what kind of end game are we shooting for now? I mean, up front, I think our biggest objective, I think, has already been achieved. I don't, at this time, it does not appear there's much of a chance that Ukraine will fall to Russia. I mean, there's still a lot of fear floating around and all that, but in reality, I don't think that's very likely now. Unless, of course, the Russians were to choose to really massively escalate the thing in some ways, and it wouldn't be so much capturing it as destroying it. And I don't think that would be a whole area that doesn't seem to be in the cards right now. I think that what we're looking at now is that the Russians are still looking for some way to come out of something that they can politically claim with the normal deception, and they're known to be very deceptive, that it was a success in some ways, even though, well, what they tried was a failure. And as I pointed out before, the real issue was that they spread way too thin. Their objectives were way too overarching, and were based on the idea that they could just roll in there with pure speed and take the capital. But the fact of the matter is that the battle for the capital was really fought in terrain that was very unsuitable to armored movements. I mean, when you're driving armored vehicles down a single road, for instance, lined with forests on both sides, and going into an environment where state-of-the-art anti-infantry, anti-tank weapons are widely deployed among the Ukrainian troops, it was fairly easy to inflict a high degree of attrition. And and ultimately, of course, that led to the outcome that we saw. Now I think the Russians have pulled back to much more limited objectives. And the question here is, they've had discussions previously of things like no-fly zones, but this is not too applicable unless they really do try to move toward Odessa, because otherwise you're talking about areas that are relatively close to the Russian border itself. And so we're not talking about just staying, and it's pretty hard to implement something like that in that environment, because most of Ukraine is, what it is. I guess that was one issue that was out there. And the other thing is, do we really want to how far do you want to push? Do you want to push clear to the Russian border or into the Russian border? I mean, and that's where I think what the CIA director was discussing is possible. I mean, earlier I'd point out that I didn't see any real utility of the Russians using tactical nuclear weapons when they were trying to take the capital, because, again, at that point, they were basically moving in very congested areas and trying to capture things. And I didn't see the kind of targets they were looking at, which were mainly a lot of light infantry, and some artillery. The other thing the Ukrainians have done pretty well is use of drones in connection with artillery, to use them as spotters. And of course, that has proven to be at least somewhat effective as a disruptive tactic, if nothing else. So at any rate, a lot of vehicles have been destroyed. Again, the actual casualties I've discussed previously, are still a big conflict as to exactly what they are. They're obviously high, but the question is how high. I mean, that's some estimates would probably put the casualty levels at the level of like 60,000. And I don't know, that seems to be like more destruction that seems to be possible as a practical matter. Meanwhile, the Russians have claimed like they've shot down all but one of the Turkish drones, and that doesn't seem to be very credible either. Of course, and what's really interesting about all this has been the complete failure of Russian electronic warfare, which was supposed to be one of their real strong suits. We had expected, based on previous incidents, that they would have really high-quality electronic warfare that would disrupt the use of drones, for example, and would disrupt their air defenses and so forth. And yet, this doesn't seem to have occurred in practice. And the whole reasons for this are still unknown. It's hard to know. And also, the complete failure of the vaunted Russian cyber warfare capability is another thing. It's possible that the U.S. has developed a variety of techniques secretly that have been held in reserve that have been unleashed here that we had previously not known about. And especially in terms of cyber warfare, I think is a relevant question. And so, like I said, the thing has reached a stalemate, but the question is, what objectives does Ukraine really have at this point? The idea of completely liberating all their territories is the situation where the thing could escalate, because the Russians have defined the idea of using nuclear weapons as when they face an existential threat. But the point is, what do they consider existential? And the U.S. would think that meant a direct destruction of attack on the United States homeland, right? But that's probably not the way Putin sees it. Putin probably sees an existential threat as a threat to his regime. Anything that would remove him from power, he would probably consider to be an existential threat. And it's probably also true that a lot of his minions around him, if you want to call them that, probably see the same thing as kindly true. Do they really see a way out in which they also won't become casualties of the fall of the regime? And in fact, it's possible that the whole of Russia could collapse into anarchy in that scenario too, which is not a good thing. The one thing that Putin had brought is some degree of stability. I mean, I can remember the period in the 90s when things were quite chaotic there, when you had colonels that were in charge of nuclear forces working as night watchmen to get food for their family. When you saw nuclear warheads from disassembled missiles sitting out in what looks sort of like a farmyard. I mean, it wasn't a facility with barbed wire and guard dogs and armed troops around it. It seemed very. I'm sitting there. Those are at least 500 kiloton warheads just sitting there in the open. That didn't strike me as being exactly a very safe situation. Fortunately, we got through the whole thing, and as far as I can tell, no terrorist got hold of a nuclear weapon during that period. But a collapse of the Soviet Russia regime totally is not necessarily a good thing for the stability of the world either. And I think that basically this whole episode has definitely blunted any real aggressive tendencies that they have for the foreseeable future. I mean, it's been a complete fiasco, and so the question I think is how do you bring this thing to a close without provoking a greater level of damage than already has been done? And what only happens in Russia in terms of their sanctions and economy is a whole different issue, but that itself also provides many problems for us. For instance, all these sanctions we've got on them at the present time may not be good for them, but it's not necessarily good for the world either. I mean, a lot of our own financial institutions are the ones that are going to come up short with these defaults. There may be a battle in lawsuits over who gets the Russian overseas monies, because Ukraine, obviously, with all of its great damage, certainly has a pretty major claim to make as well as the financial institutions. And then we have the cutoff of agricultural and fertilizer from those areas, which, while it may lead to greater food prices in the U.S. and the developed Western world, may lead to famine in the underdeveloped world. Now these are the kind of issues that we kind of face going forward with this situation. And so I think we need to pursue a prudent path here rather than, let's say, get into a revenge mode here, which could really be destructive for everybody, including Ukraine. Well, at any rate, I think I'll kind of wrap this up. I do want to mention one other thing about the COVID situation. We've had some really erratic reporting on the Johns Hopkins website, which I follow and make charts on it. But really, if you go back to April the 8th, which was a low point in cases, and now you're looking at maybe a difference of about 4,000 cases reported on a weekly moving average, and that was a kind of unique low pace. So it looks like the cases have bottomed, and there may be a slight increase due to the BA2 variant of Omicron. But so far, there's no real sign of a major upsurge. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. But at the moment, I think that it doesn't really look like it's really going much of anywhere at the moment. But you never know. These things are somewhat spontaneous. Well, at any rate, the addresses of my various social media accounts are in the links below. I finally did get on Truth also, so it took a long time, but it finally did happen yesterday. And so, at any rate, I'll wrap this up for now, and until next time.